So
This feels extremely cozy.
yeah, this is really cozy. It feels warm even. Yeah, yeah.
I want to bring some tea and some sweets and
Yeah,
get a book and get a bit of reading. Yeah.
or maybe red wine, right? So yeah, let's get started. I'm super thankful you're here.
I'm really
Uh,
excited to be here.
yeah,
Thanks for the.
super inspired by your story and about approaching VCing in a disruptive way. I feel, and so we feel very honored that you're here. Can you please introduce yourself, maybe, and tell a bit about where you're from, Hardware Club. What is it?
Sure. Yeah. First, thanks for having me. I'm really excited. The way we met was originally, I think you joined Hardware Club 4 years ago, and
Yeah.
I think seeing this conference, seeing this space, and seeing these many people gathered, makes me feel good about the future of IoT, and it's super exciting. So thanks for doing this, and we're always trying to support this ecosystem, and I think you guys are doing a wonderful job there. So yeah, thanks for that. My story is that 5 years ago, actually a little more than 5 years ago, we started investing in startups that were building products, building atoms, and we realized that a lot of them didn't necessarily have the support from the VC community in general, because VCs had this image that hardware startups were like semiconductor startups, so startups that were building large products that needed years to come to market and needed to raise tons of funding, and so they didn't want to touch that. They only wanted to do the marketplaces, e-commerce, next Facebook, and all that. And we realized that there was a potential because there was this first generation of Kickstarter-backed companies that was showing that customers wanted those products, but there was not necessarily the ecosystem to fund those companies yet. And so we said, okay, why don't we do this? Why don't we build this? And we really much started Hardware Club as, why don't we build a fund and a community and an ecosystem that people would want to be part of? And if we manage to do that, there's going to be a lot of value for us and for this ecosystem created. So 5 years ago, we started a fund by telling people that we would not invest in their company, but that we would help them with resources and an ecosystem in general. So that's for the first 2 years of what we've done with Hardware Club. We built a community where we said, we're going to try and gather the best hardware companies in Europe, in the US, in an ecosystem where they're going to get access to resources. The issues that companies had back then were, can I manufacture my product? Can I find a factory in China? Can I find a distributor for my product? How much does a distributor cost and all that? And we felt like bringing people together and creating that ecosystem where people could talk on a Slack group, on private events where they could gather together, was the best way to kind of make those, that value and that knowledge kind of shared. So we started that. We grew the community from 20 startups in Europe to now over 500 companies in 40 countries. So it's, grown quite a lot, and now we've got it's amazing that when we started really much in Europe, and now we've got most of our community in the US. Yeah. We started our office in in San Francisco in October 2015, I think, so a little more than 3 years and a half now. The community has grown. There's been a lot of ups and downs in the hardware community in general. A lot of stuff that I think we'll touch regarding consumer hardware, especially. And what's amazing is that there's been this maturity that we've reached in terms of first the ecosystem that's visible here, and startups now with people originally started with ideas that were very much like consumer gadgets and now building real use cases for real industries. And I think that's fascinating. Just to finish so we built a community first and we built a fund. So we raised the fund on top of the community. The idea was that, okay, we're going to create this group of people that, that we're potentially going to want to fund, but we're going to start by resources and we're going to fund them or we're going to fund part of them at early stage with a fund. And so now we're currently investing our first fund, which is $50 million. We're investing half of it in Europe, half of it in the US. And so far, so good. We're really excited about the type of companies we see.
It's such an interesting story where you just first created the community and then just first focus on the value and then focus on the business model. Yeah, that is something that's right in our alley. It's really cool. I remember joining the hardware club, and we were that instance that we did a crazy Kickstarter, and it starts up with like a big victory of like having the funding, and then the nightmare begins of executing on that plan. And I think probably people here in the room have seen us suffer there, and then the hardware club community was really nice place to be. Like if we wanted to look for, literally just ask a question: is that like who has experience with manufacturing? And then somebody came up with a list. And I can remember one example which I won't forget is that we were negotiating with a distributor. So we thought, okay, like what can a distributor make out of the product? So I said, hey, what is your average margin you grant your distributor? I said like 5-10%. And they said, oh no, like 50% for sure. So I was like, oh, right. So you have all these questions when you go into hardware, and I can even remember there was a person they were selling sex toys. And he said, no, in our industry, it's 90%.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Like, crazy. So yeah, I mean, that like, really got me with my feet on the ground. I said, okay, like my Excel is going to look a bit different. Right? So yeah, I mean, it's completely awesome. So yeah, let's dig in then to the fund. So are there any general trends you see like you already discussed that you had this hype of Kickstarters, and then at the top, I think at the top of the hype there was this selfie drone of 6 million, and that crashed, and that like
oh yeah,
I think it was 2015 somewhere. But what do you see? What happened next, and what's happening now? What's happening in the future?
I think we've seen crazy stuff on the consumer side, and you know, I think Kickstarter. I totally relate to what you were saying on Kickstarter. Kickstarter felt that experience where people would start a project online, would put some renderings on the internet, and then they would win the lottery, right? There would be like a few millions in the bank. Only the next day someone would come and say, oh, you need to give the money back to all those people in those countries. And so that was a nightmare for so many companies. And I think that also was the starting point of, you know, all those questions that people had, they had no answers to them, and we needed to find a way, a space where they could discuss that. And that's really much why we started Hardware Club. Yeah, I mean, when you talk about trends, I think when we started Hardware Club, there was a lot of stuff we did around consumer. And most of what we were doing, most of the companies that were applying were consumer startups. It was basically 70% consumer, 30% industrial, medical, enterprise startups. Now, 5 years later, it's the opposite. Now we've got 75% of what we're seeing in terms of applications to Hardware Club that are actually enterprise, industrial, real life use cases. And the consumer part is now about 20 to 25%. So it's only a small part. The reason for that is that that ecosystem, the consumer hardware ecosystem, as you know, has seen a huge boom when everyone felt they could raise money on Kickstarter, etc. But hasn't been successful in the next steps. Very, very few companies were able to scale the way Nest, for example, was able to scale, or the way Peloton, or the way Misfit was able to scale. So that meant that now, if you're doing consumer hardware, if you're doing consumer robotics, I was talking to a consumer robotics founder yesterday. He was telling me, oh, I'm trying to find funds that will fund me. It was like, well, good luck with that. You know? It's really tough. Because a lot of investors, us included, have been burnt by the complexity of having to deal with a supply chain that's really complex. What you're typically doing is that you're going to need to spend money to build a product a few months ahead of actually getting the product, and then you're going to give that product to distributors that are going to pay you 30, 60, 90 days later sometimes. Yeah. So you've got this huge period of time where you need to spend and burn cash just to get revenue. And sometimes, quite often, the margins are low because, as you said, distributors take large margins. And they don't even do a good job of trying to pitch your product. We've had products, some companies in our portfolio, fought really, really hard, like months, to get to Best Buy. They were really excited to get into 100 Best Buys, and then nothing happened because their products ended up next to the toilets. The people there, the salespeople at Best Buy, didn't even know what those products were doing there, what was the use cases. they wouldn't even know how to explain the product to the consumer, so that nothing really happened. And I think that explains what happened on that side. I don't want to sound too negative. There's tons of things that have happened and that have emerged from that ecosystem. There's a lot of interesting things on the consumer side. I think especially around mobility. I think we're investors in a company in Belgium that's called Carboy that's building a smart e-bike. Amazing company. I mean that's public. So the second year of sales, they are the first time they're selling over 12 months, they're going to generate about 10 million in revenue, which is amazing on a market that's growing. We're really excited about mobility. There's this huge trend between from what people buying cars and now trying to find other ways to move around cities, and so that's why micromobility as an ecosystem has grown pretty large. There's a lot of interesting things in digital health that are happening. We've invested in a few companies that are doing very interesting things where when you think about the way we were medicating ourselves, which was that, whenever you felt bad, you were going to a doctor, and then your doctor would tell you, like, go take those pills, and then you wouldn't really get feedback about what's happening in your body, and now you've got companies that are trying to give you data about what's happening and interact with that data as well. I think that's cool. Really interesting as a trend.
Yeah. Yeah, so the trends, you say mobility health, that is where your interest is. Interesting. So then if you look at, you already mentioned like B2B, B2C, you see more industrial. This is typically mostly industrial as well. So what about the dynamics between strategic investment and like just pure financial investment? Because you said like there's this like gap of dead money, which is the 90-day payment period of your distributor, right? So this is a huge, let's say, friction point. Yeah. But like it's actually not risky money as well. So there, of course, you also see that strategic investors can solve in these supply chain cash flow problems. But can you tell me like a bit more what you see in the market, like what's going strategic, what's not, and what's your opinion on that, and how do founders benefit, or how do the corporates benefit from that?
I think industrial IoT is amazing. I mean, out of the few things that we were looking at originally, that's the one that's grown the most. I think that there's a lot of use cases. Originally, I think there were a lot of people trying to do things, trying to build use cases that they were gonna potentially showcase to clients. And when we started, I remember a lot of companies doing POCs and all that. Now we're seeing real contracts. We're seeing companies making money, making recurring revenue with large clients. And that's really, really interesting. And I think the whole trends towards like bringing more data in the factory, having more sensors, trying to understand how machines work, how the whole factory can be made in a more flexible, more easy to repurpose way, so that you can decrease these incredible costs that factories used to have whenever they were trying to build a new product. So I think that's really, really exciting. To your question, which is, what do you think about strategic investors in general and all that? I think a lot of the deals we've done over the past 12 months, when you think about industry use cases, were with strategic investors. Because quite often, if you're doing something very specific for a specific industry, that's easier to pitch the people that have the problem, meaning the strategic companies that have those problems in their factories about what you're doing, than trying to pitch a VC that's going to invest again in a marketplace, in a robotic company, in a lot of different things. Which so the problem, they're going to have probably a hard time to understand exactly the problem you're going after. So we're just actually joining a round of a company in the US now, where the round is led by Lockheed Martin. That's a company in the autonomy space, building new type of sensors. We're investors in France in a company called Aribal that's building a smelling sensor, so a sensor for odors.
Okay, cool.
They've already built the equivalent of the human nose on a very tiny sensor that's the size of a MEMS.
Oh, awesome.
And that company's got 60% of its funding. So they've already raised about 12 million, and 60% of the funding came from people like IFF, which is one of the largest fragrance companies in the world, from Asahi Kasei, which is a huge group in Japan, from Hyundai, from a lot of corporates, strategic players. And I think that makes a lot of sense because not only can they find people that understand what they're doing, that can support them with resources and an ecosystem, business units that may use the product at some point, but they can also, get that validation that they can also use to convince VCs, right? It's much easier to go to a VC and tell them, okay, I'm building this so that Samsung can do that. If Samsung is an investor in the company and is able to jump on a ref call and say, this is right, this works, rather than trying to talk to them about a case that may not be very.
And as a pure financial investor, it's not pure financial because you're bringing on, of course, all this knowledge and ecosystem, but. So you like it because it reduces your risk, but it also can reduce your upside. So how do you feel as a VC? Like how do you, if you have this case, there's a trade-off, right? Like where the risk is reduced, most of the time the upside is also reduced. So how do you feel about that then?
So we organized a conference in a few months back in San Francisco, and we had a panel with strategic investors, and the moderator was asking the question like, how many companies have you invested in, and how many of those companies have you acquired? And what's funny is that most strategic corporate investors don't acquire the companies they invest in. Yeah. If they want to acquire the company, they'll acquire the company.
Buy it. Yeah.
So I think that's one. There's very bad cases of that. There are companies that behave very poorly with startups. I'm not saying that this world is all beautiful, that's a fairy tale and all that. No, there's definitely, you need to be careful as a startup whenever you talk to them and trying to make sure that they don't get governance right so that they can't make these decisions or veto any decision when you want to sell the company one day. So, but in most cases, I don't think it's an issue. I think what strategic investors are trying to do when they invest in a company is get part of that value, get close to the company so they can work with them. And if they see that at some point that company would be a better fit internally, they'll make an offer. And most often what you want to do as a founder is you want to make sure that they don't have a veto right over someone else coming and acquiring the company. Yeah. In that sense, you don't necessarily limit the upside when the company is sold.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Super interesting.
And there was actually data showing that companies that receive funding from strategic investors get better exits in terms of acquisitions. Because what's strategic buyers are doing when they do their due diligence. They're trying to understand who's part of the cap table. They're trying to see if your technology is seen as valid by the market, and if the more strategic investors you have, the more validation that provides.
And always better than a crazy uncle, right?
Yeah.
That is okay. Cool. Yeah. So we're touching this landscape. So what kind of investments? Let's pick industrial IoT because this more relates to the crowd here. Like, what kind of notable investments mentionable do you think? And could you do a breakdown of one of these? Do you have something on top of mind? Is that?
Yeah, companies in the space. I mean, I mentioned Haribal, which is a company we funded at.
And what do they do?
So they build the smelling sensor.
The nose.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So their use cases are actually industry, right? So,
okay, cool.
Quality control. Well, there's also a lot of use cases. Someone, I was going to say smarter than me, said that everywhere you can put a camera, you could put their sensor. So there's a lot of industrial use cases, but there's also use cases potentially in health tomorrow. Yeah, we've invested in interesting companies. One of the companies we've invested in, for example, is called Gideon Brothers. It's a company in Croatia that's building mobile robots that can move autonomously in the factory.
Ah, cool.
And the idea is that we all know what a Fordist factory was like, which was a chain. Everything was going in a certain way. That worked really, really well whenever you were manufacturing a car for 5 years and without a need to customize or repurpose. Now what we're seeing is that more and more factories look like different hubs that are where units are being transformed in a certain way, and there's a huge need to repurpose things and customize things. And so you don't want to, manufacture the same black car. You want to be able to manufacture a set of different cars and to be able to change things really easily. And so in order to do that, you need to change the way the factory is built. And what they do is that they basically build those robots that can move units from one part of the factory to another one, and especially with robots that are aware of their environment. Because the issue with the previous generation of industrial robots is that you needed to pre-code them. You needed to give them a universe that was really fixed, which was like X, Y, Z. They needed to go there. So there was a lot of calibration needed for the robots to work. The next generation of robots, which we're really excited about, is building context-aware machines that know what to do. So you'll tell the machines what to do and not necessarily how to do it. And that's what's really exciting. So that's a really exciting trend we're seeing. So that company, Gideon Brothers, we've invested in. They are now in several factories in Germany, for example. That company is originally from Croatia, which is was our very first investment in Croatia. And yeah, we've seen a lot of interesting things around that trend in general, which is trying to build sensor, putting cameras in factories to understand what's happening, and making there's this concept of which I think is really interesting, which is software-defined manufacturing. Okay. So how can you?
That's the new hype. Couldn't it be a new hype term? Software-defined manufacturing.
Yeah,
I think sounds super nice.
If there's one you need to keep out of this conversation, software-defined manufacturing. And there's a few companies building this, like Bright Machines in the US. That's that was basically a spin-off from Flextronics. That's building this. That's building a factory where you're not trying to have very, very complex and complicated machines and robots with a lot of code and all talking their own proprietary language and all that. You're trying to build quite simple and flexible machines that can work together in a seamless way. That's kind of the concept. And in order to do that, you want to make sure that you create kind of Legos in terms of code, in terms of machines, so that you can basically easily repurpose them. You can easily make them work together. You need to create that OS that's gonna oversee whatever, how the factory works, and that's going to be able to command one action to a machine and to another one in a seamless way and all that. So
super.
You need way less integration that you need in the past.
That's building an abstraction layer between the mechanics of the robotics and their purpose.
Yeah.
So it's that's like building an app store for robotics. It's software is eating the world. What is it? Who was it? Andreessen that said it. But yeah, cool. So super interesting. So somebody comes to you with a pitch deck, or with a story. What are the red flags? What's the moment you directly check out?
Well, the first thing is the team, right? Yeah. So that's by far, we invest early. We look at the team. I've invested in companies where originally I didn't believe in the product and I didn't believe in the market, just because the team was incredible and made me think that I was wrong and that they were right and that I should just give them my money because they were smarter than I. And that's really much what I'm looking for, to be very honest. We have a lot of, as VCs, we have a lot of pride of, having ideas, being able to make forecasts, predictions and all that. I think all of this is partly bullshit, honestly. I think our job is to find smarter people than us, to create companies and really just provide them with an ecosystem and some resources that can help them at some points. So the first thing we look at, obviously, is the team. So we want usually some diversity, some experience, because the one thing is whenever you're building something physical, you're going to need a little experience. Mistakes are expensive compared. That's one of the issues of hardware investing versus software investing. If there's an error in the code of an app, you can probably fix that overnight. Yeah. It's a little more complicated when you've shipped thousands of products, right? Yeah. So that's one thing that you need, a bit of experience, so you actually understand. You've been there, you've done some mistakes, you've probably spent some money and burnt some money doing that. So you're not going to do it with this current company. And then we look obviously the product. So when we invest very, very early, it's a little hard to really understand if the product has a fit with the market, but we still try and find ways to assess if there's a market demand. And the last one is market. So there's very different ways to look at markets. Either you look at a very large market with legacy players that haven't been innovating, and you think, okay, those players are not necessarily reinventing themselves, they're not agile enough, so a startup has actually a good chance of winning that market. Or you can sometimes start with a market that looks a little more like a niche, but that's actually growing and that may become something much larger. So that's, but by far the first thing we look at, and the first reason why we invest in companies is really just because we believe in the guys and we think they're smarter than us.
Right. Yeah, super cool. So we touched the subjects of strategic investment by an enterprise or corporate or financial, but of course you see a lot of hardware development is driven by companies itself. I saw statistics that the Apple AirPod would have been like a multi-billion-dollar unicorn in a matter of like 12 months or something. It's crazy how successful that product introduction was. Probably one of the best product introductions ever been. So my question would be is like, as a hardware startup, how do you act in this dynamic, right? Like because you don't want to do something that just can blow you away, right? Like how do you look at that?
You mean competing with large companies like Apple and all that?
Yeah, that's always the cliche VC question is like, yeah, but what if Google does it? Yeah. So how do you look at that? Because it's
we've invested in companies where Amazon did it. that didn't end up really well. It's always hard. I think one thing we look at whenever we invest in a company is, is this very close from what Amazon's currently doing, and is it quite close? Would that be the next step in their product roadmap? We've invested in a robotics company that was doing a home robot that unfortunately didn't end up well, and that company closed last year. By the way, a lot of what we invest in doesn't work. Most companies we fund actually don't work. That's one thing that people sometimes don't necessarily understand. 50% of what we're going to fund is not going to work. So we're paid by people to lose money. We're just going to make money on a few companies. And so coming back to what you were saying, so you just want to make sure that you're not doing something that's core to those companies, that's like too close to their current roadmap, so that people are not necessarily going to, VCs are not going to be asking those questions, or they're not going to feel like it's a potentially existential threat to the company. But it's hard. I mean, like if you look at the wearable space, there were a lot of the AirPods are a good example. There were a lot of startups building similar products, right? And some of them went to Kickstarter and actually raised pretty large round. How do you compete with Apple? Well, I don't have an answer to that. I was, even Pebble, right? Pebble was, the first company building smartwatches. They were early. They were the first player in the space. They were selling really, really well. They were like going to Kickstarter every 6 months. They were like doing $20 million campaigns. They seemed like the next company that was going to own that market. They were probably the market leader back then. And then Apple got in. I remember talking to Eric, the CEO back then, and was like, oh, what do you feel about that? They were like, oh, it's great. Apple's going to come. They're going to educate the market. We think that we have a different product. Our product's probably better in terms of we understand the market better. And like a year later, they were not there anymore. The company closed, right? So and there was very smart guys backed by Silicon Valley investors. They had tons of money. It's just hard because there's a lot of experience that's been accumulated at Apple. Their engineering teams are amazing. Their brand is incredible. You're really going to have a tough time, competing with them. So you want to think hard about how you're positioning your product, which market you're getting into, and not to get too close to those companies that you're not going to be able to compete with.
Super interesting. So we're done with our time. 30 minutes are over. I want to thank you very much. I think it's super insightful, and it's also great that you share. It's not a fairy tale as well. We always say is that 50% of the IoT startups for proof of concepts fail, and it's not nothing else if you do investment. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having
your
me.
time and coming over and.
Thank you.
Big round of applause.